More Perils in Paradise cards today. We've got a bunch of Warlock stuff. I'm a little late with these. Some of these came out early over the weekend, and some came out in like Australia time. So I'm behind, but still a lot to talk about because I think there's some pretty cool cards here, including this legendary and another one that goes with it. This is Summoner Dark Marrow, a 4-mana 4/4 undead. This is the Death Knight Tourist, which again means when you add this to your deck, you'll be able to run Death Knight cards from this expansion. It also reads, your Death Rattles trigger twice, and after you play a Death Rattle minion, destroy it. So there are like a million things going on with this card, all in one way or another synergizing with Death Rattles. The Death Knight Tourist part could synergize with Death Rattles. We haven't seen the Death Knight cards yet, but wouldn't be shocked at all if Death Knight got some Death Rattle cards. Pretty fitting synergy and keyword for that class, but we'll see, I think, tomorrow whether or not this gets a follow-up. But generally, as we've said, I'm giving all of the Tourist cards a pretty high rating just because having access to 2 classes worth of cards on average seems pretty darn beneficial. And then Dark Marrow also just has a really nice effect here, and we're going to see some good Death Rattle stuff showing up in this set. Let's just preview some of these. Party Planner Vona summons you this Ouroboros, which gives you a crazy Death Rattle, which summons an Ouroboros. Then you've got the Sacrificial Imp, which is a Death Rattle that summons a 6/6. You've got some Death Rattle synergy stuff. This helps you destroy Death Rattles. This discounts Death Rattles, and I think that's it for now. We'll talk about the spicy card later. So some stuff coming along. Also keep in mind there's just, like egg things in general that could be nice for Death Rattles, whether in this set or otherwise. Warlock also has some good like egg sort of Death Rattle-y synergy stuff, like Chaotic Consumption still around, right? You play an egg, you play this, you're pretty happy. So I do see a sort of swarmy Death Rattle package coming together for Warlock here. I don't necessarily think it'll be a big one. I think it would be more about like playing small stuff, particularly because if you are trying to play this for the last sentence of its text there, after you play a Death Rattle minion, destroy it, you're going to need fairly cheap follow-ups to make that feel relevant, because you kind of have to play all that in one turn, presumably. This basically never lives for 2 turns. So, you're spending 4. You need some cheap egg-style stuff, a 1-drop, 2-drop, whatever, to follow that up to make it feel impactful. And I would be really worried if that was the only text line on this card. But because your Death Rattles trigger twice, I like that this card can both be played like all at once, like I just talked about, for like a turn out of nowhere where you just try to generate a board out of nowhere. Alternatively, this can be played after a Death Rattle has already been established. And I think that is where this card is really going to shine, much like, of course, the old Baron Rivendare. Not that I would say Baron Rivendare particularly shined, but this is where the opportunities will be created. So you establish a cool Death Rattle. Maybe it's that 3-drop Sacrificial Imp, although this one's awfully risky, I would say. And then you play the Dark Marrow afterwards, utilizing that Rivendare effect for your Death Rattles going off twice. So sometimes, you'll already have the board developed, and this will be a really nice payoff to your Death Rattles. Other times you may not have a board, but you can still kind of in a pinch generate something by starting off with the Dark Marrow. And that dual utility, I think, really does stretch this card pretty far, and that's why I'm fairly hopeful something could come together off the back of this. This is one of those cards that ultimately just does so many things. It kind of has 3 different things going on for it at a fairly reasonable cost, all things considered, that it just feels inevitable that somebody's going to figure out a way to use this card somewhere in the next like year and a half or whatever that it's in standard format. Moving on here to the Party Planner Vona. This is a pretty cool card. 6 mana 4/4 Battle Cry. If you've taken 8 damage on your turns, summon Ouroboros, and that is turns, right? So basically any turn up to turn 6 if you want to play this on curve. So, life taps count. We have plenty of Pain Warlock stuff right now. As we know, Pain Warlock has been a very good deck in Hearthstone and in the recent era. So getting to 8 damage feels fairly trivial for this. And then I think you get a pretty nice play when that happens. You get a 4/4 and an 8/8 all at once. And this 8/8 with the Ouroboros has this really crazy Death Rattle. Give a minion in your hand, Death Rattle, summon Ouroboros. So basically, you just start chaining this Ouroboros, presumably summoning it multiple times over the course of a game. It is like a little slow because it's a Death Rattle on the next iteration. So it's like you have to get the card in hand, play the card has to die. So it might take, you know, kind of a 2-turn cycle basically to get each new Ouroboros in play. Although with rush minions, you know, that could certainly come out faster if you start taking some trades and stuff. So ultimately, it's just kind of a value grindy piece for a Pain Warlock deck, which I'm a little hesitant about. Like, I love this sort of card. It's, you know, crazy value, like endless 8/8. Like, that sounds really, really fun to me. But I will say Pain Warlock generally wins its games far more decisively at an earlier stage than this would be impactful. In other words, you know, you're trying to slam those free Molten Giants and the free Imprisoned Horrors and just overwhelm people on like turn 4 or 5 or whatever it is. This is kind of a backup plan almost, I would say. And it may be a little bit meta dependent, but sometimes these backup plan cards just like sit in hand and don't really do anything in the games you're winning. And then sometimes they're not enough to bail you out of the games that you're losing. Like if you didn't hit the home run stuff early, is this enough of kind of a win condition card that it will grind people out? Like, can this give you that edge in those matchups where you don't hit the home runs early and get the crazy overwhelming boards in the mid game? That's the big question for me on this one. Now, that said, I don't know that I love this in Pain Warlock for that reason. Like, it might still make the cut just because it's just, you know, it's not a bad turn 6 play. It's still a big pile of stats in its own right. But where I like this card perhaps even more is just like in a control Warlock deck. You know, as long as Sargeras exists in standard format, there is always that potential viability, I think, for some kind of grindier, controllier Warlock. And those decks generally still take damage on their turns via life tap. We've got the card draw guy that's played in Pain Warlock. Why can't I think of the name? Manufacturing error, no, mass production. You know, you got this could be a card you just play in a control Warlock to cycle a little bit, and you know, it doesn't take much, basically just a few select cards here and there, maybe a Spirit Bomb or something for some cheap removal, and you can suddenly create Ouroboros as, you know, a threat development in a control Warlock deck where you're not necessarily playing all in on the Pain stuff. It just sort of happens, and then you have yourself a really nice value card that still has defensive utility, of course, because for this card, just like more generally and broadly in Warlock, as well as maybe you know, a Pain going off multiple times sounds really fun. Multiple Ouroboros getting summoned all the time, just filling up your hand with all these crazy high value Ouroboros death rattles. So both these cards look pretty. Oh, and I forgot to mention Rogue, including Vona, can be played in Rogue. Of course, the Tor included. Otherwise, of course, you could just infinitely chain tourists, but Vona can be played damage on their turns thanks to weapon attacks. You can swing in with your weapon, clearing stuff up, and take damage pretty easily. So there's maybe a world where you could play this in Rogue as just kind of a value bomb card again, just getting, you know, a nice value piece. Most Rogue decks don't exactly have the survivability to take that risk though, and you know, their game plans don't generally play towards like grindy value matchups. So I don't know, man. I don't necessarily see this making a ton of. Moving on here to the Sacrificial Imp. This is a 3-mana 1/6 demon death rattle. If it's your turn, summon a 6/6 imp with taunt, which certainly when that goes off, that is a big pile of total stats. You know, 6/6 for 3, little 1/6 bonus. And obviously, if you like double this death rattle, that's nuts. The question and challenge, of course, though, is the killing it on your turn part, which we will see, of course, some cards that can do that very reliably. Eat the Imp here, for instance. This is kind of a 5-mana play where you summon a 6/6 and draw 3 cards. We already talked about chaotic consumption, I think, right? Like, and get a big old 6/6 Imp. So there are some things that kind of make sense in an Egg Warlock deck. The challenge for this card is when that doesn't line up and you don't have those cards, how much are you willing to risk playing out your Sacrificial Imp? Does it usually just die on turn? into it or whatever, you know, or some rush minions or whatever. I think it usually dies on turn 3. 6 health is that really close breakpoint though, where it might just skirt by in many cases, you know, where they can't quite muster up enough damage. But then you have the challenge of, like, if you still don't have an activator, it's hard for you to trade it in too, because likely the opponent only has like 3 attack stuff on board. So it's still kind of hard for you to trade it off and activate. So it does feel like getting this to work via like on-board trading is very unlikely. I think if this works, it's usually going to be because you have some kind of specific activator. And then you've got this kind of conditionality tied to it, which makes me nervous. And in that case, I might just rather run like more consistent egg cards, you know, like maybe I'd just rather run Nerubian Egg, because I think that's far more likely. Body is a little bit worse payoff, but it just seems easier to weave in and less risky that it backfires. This goes away. And you don't really want to have to sit on it in hand either. So, you know, it's sort of like either a dead card in hand or sometimes a risk of 3 mana. Sometimes it wouldn't matter much. But also, it's just like a little bit more expensive to weave in with those activators. You know, suddenly this is a 5 mana play, which is a lot slower than, say, a Nerubian Egg. You know, you get it down for 4 and you're maybe much happier. So, a little bit clunky and a little bit risky for a marginally better payoff. And I fear that's going to leave it in a weird spot when there are probably just other good, cheaper Death Rattles you're happy to activate. This is still close, though, because 6/6 is big. Taunt is a little bit helpful. So if an egg deck comes together with enough activators, you know, maybe, for instance, some like Death Knight stuff pops into that supports this kind of thing, then I would give Sacrificial Imp the bump into playability. Oh, and Rogue just has no reason to play this. I'm going to keep forgetting to talk about Rogue stuff because I don't think most of these cards are very good for Rogue. Moving on to Eat the Imp. This is quite horrific, by the way. This is a 2-mana fire spell. Destroy a friendly minion to draw 3 cards. And yeah, I mean, 2-mana draw 3 is very good. That's quite efficient. That said, Warlock does have access to a lot of really efficient, good, cheap card draw already. So this is competing. Some classes would absolutely murder for this, but with Warlock, you know, it's got some peers that do this very well already. Destroying friendly minion, of course, can be a good thing, as we've talked about with eggs and death rattles and so on, right? These activators can be very useful. It can also get stuck sometimes if there's nothing you really want to destroy. You don't have, say, like a hero power button like Paladin, where you can just make a free 1/1 and easily activate this and kind of dig for that next thing that you need. So there is some moments where this could feel awkward, where you feel like you have to destroy something better, or maybe you just don't have that cheap kind of fodder card in hand available in order to activate your card draw. So sometimes that can backfire a little bit. But ultimately, I think if a Death Rattle Egg Warlock deck comes together, this is exactly the kind of card you want, right? A fairly cheap activator, keeps the gears turning, keeps things moving, both on board and refilling your hand with some nice stuff. So, you know, it's a very specific card. It's probably limited to that one within that niche. And again, I just don't see Rogue needing this. Rogue has so much card draw and probably not enough good stuff to destroy. You know, this seems unnecessary for them. Moving on to the Fellfire Bonfire. This is a 4-mana Fell spell. It is deal 4 damage to a minion, and if it dies, your next Death Rattle minion costs 3 less. This is kind of a neat little option here, right? Basically, this looks like a 1-mana deal 4 when you consider all of that mana together. But one thing I do like about this is that it lets you bank that discount. It doesn't have to be this turn or anything, so you could like play this on turn 4 and then cheat like a big 8-cost Death Rattle into play on turn 5, right? By banking that discount into the next turn. So there are things, you know, like Enhanced Dreadlord, for instance, that could be played on turn 5. That's a big old nice pile of stuff. You know, 8-cost Death Rattles. You know, the Wretched Queen also showed up. Again, a nice big pile of stuff for Warlock. So to me, this actually makes sense and looks better in a bigger Warlock deck, because I think cheating that stuff out is nice. When you're playing this just as a sort of tempo enabler in a, like, you know, an egg Warlock deck, you know, playing it with your Sacrificial Imp or whatever, I think it's a little bit less intriguing. That's when it starts to look like that 1 mana deal 4, which isn't bad, but also isn't completely insane. Because like suddenly if you take a 4 mana turn now, or you play your Fellfire Bonfire, you know, you just clean up something medium sized of your opponent at best, and you play your imp, and you still have not really managed all that good of a turn. You play, you know, whatever it is, your egg card or something, whatever, death rattle. That's just not that exciting to me. Like, it's okay, but it's just not why you're excited to do this. You're pumped about this card because you're able to cheat things into play faster, which I don't see Warlock lining up as well in that direction for the big death rattle stuff. Just the way that Dark Marrow in particular operates, generally I think you're gonna want to play this with cheaper things because sometimes you need that all in one turn, you know, and that demands probably having smaller death rattles. Although maybe you run the gamut with death rattles and kind of have a little bit of both. It's not impossible. So it's a totally fine card. Again, for Rogue, this is just super synergistically specific that I don't think Rogue needs this yet again. So moving on to this meme card, it's Announce Darkness, a 2-mana shadow spell. This replaces your hero power and non-Warlock cards with Warlock ones, and they cost 1 less. So any like Rogue, Death Knight tourist cards, any neutral cards can all be replaced with some spicy Warlock cards that are now discounted. You're also getting a cool hero power on this. It has been confirmed the hero power discount here doesn't like stack. Basically, you'll always get life tap that costs 1, so there's no way to like cheese it down to 0 or whatever. It sounds like it's giving you the base hero power and then discounting it. But ultimately, you know, a big pile of random Warlock stuff, even when discounted. Cards are so synergy driven these days. You need those hooks into other cards. You need lines. You need, you know, 1-2 card punches. There's not enough just like generally good stuff that just like playing things a little bit ahead on curve is worth it without having consistent synergies. And there's enough cards in the pool lines that a refined built deck would normally offer. So I think, unfortunately, this pile of Warlock stuff is just not worth it. I think this card exists for really fun moments. There's going to be people discover this, randomly generate this, you know, Yogs, etc., pulling off an Announced Darkness. There will be some great moments. You may not even be too sad about it in some of those instances as you get later into the game and you're just like desperate for good cards. But as something you would actually run in your deck and try to build a game plan around, I just don't see how this one makes enough sense. Even though that hero power is kind of cool, basically all of that stuff for a slightly cheaper hero power, I don't think. Moving on here to the health drink. This is a 3-mana spell. It's one of the drinks. It's got lifesteal and it deals 3 damage to a minion, which, you know, is not super efficient. Obviously, we have cheaper ways to deal 3 damage to a minion with lifesteal, but you do get a lot of value packed into this one because you get to do it 3 times, which I actually think is being underrated a little bit by people from what I've seen. Particularly with things like, you know, hand lock being a possibility. Hand size sometimes does matter, and this basically keeps your hand full while still letting you play some stuff out. And I don't know, man. I think just having some of these like little filler cards where you're, you know, looking to just kind of like, okay, I got a few extra mana here. In a pinch, I can just slam a health drink, get a little bit of survivability, keep up on board, and I think that's fine for a more control-oriented Warlock deck. They don't always need every card to be like as efficient as possible from a removal standpoint, which this has kind of been true for all the drinks we've seen so far, but a lot of them have trended a little bit too low in value, or maybe align with decks that don't necessarily want to keep stretching games out. But I think this one is so defensively aligned that a control Warlock that's looking to go a little bit longer in a game is maybe just happy to have these extra resources because they're eventually going to have some spare mana to weave these in, which I think makes these Warlock, actually. Again, though, you know, Rogue Rogue is an afterthought every time. I don't know that Rogue necessarily needs these. It does give Rogue access to healing, which it doesn't traditionally have very much access to. So maybe there's a reason to do that if you're playing, you know, Maestro and getting some hero cards. You might need a little extra survivability, but I kind of doubt it. So moving on, next up, we've got some more Pain Warlock synergy cards, including this one, the Party Fiend, a new 1-mana 1/1 demon, battlecry summon 2 1/1 fell beasts, and deal 3 damage to your hero, which, yeah, I mean, that sounds great for an aggressive Pain Warlock deck. Pain Warlock right now, still a very highly rated deck. Over the last week, it's like high tier 2, I think, basically, right now. And yeah, I think this is a really good option for that. In some ways, it's better than Flame Imp, but in some ways, you could argue it's a little bit worse than Flame Imp. You know, some of these die easier to like clean up effects, you know, whirlwind style effects. But ultimately, that doesn't usually happen that early in the game. So you're kind of getting the same amount of damage output as a Flame Imp, but with a little bit more flexibility. Sometimes, you know, trading these in or stretching out your opponent's removal across multiple things. If they have a 2-mana deal 3 card, suddenly they can't clean these up easily like they could with a Flame Imp, for instance. So just spreading those resources out is generally a beneficial sort of thing, and ultimately still fuels a Pain Warlock game plan with this damage. So I think this is really good 1-drop. It doesn't have to be in Pain Warlock, by the way. Any aggressive deck that's just looking to get down on turn 1 can absolutely run Party Fiend. Even Rogue might often value that. Just getting 3 1/1s down for a Rogue is pretty nice too. The downside for Rogue is that they will have to run their Tourist card, which doesn't necessarily point towards an aggressive deck. Maestra is kind of like a slow, more late game oriented card. So there would be a bit of a deck building sacrifice in order to run this card, which might not be worth it in a Rogue. But if they can piece together enough things, it could get over the hump, because I think this is just a really strong, obvious 1-drop. Moving on to the Fearless Flame Juggler. This is a 2-mana 1/1 demon with Battlecry gain stats equal to the damage your hero has taken this turn, which clearly, again, can synergize rather nicely with Pain Warlock. I will venture, though, that I think this is a little bit harder to weave in on a Pain Warlock than you might expect. Some Legend Climb recently, and I did feel like a lot of the times I was playing, you know, my big, like, you know, for instance, a good example is the Malefic Rook, the 3-mana 5/6 guy, right? Like, you want to play that dude on curve on 3, and you want to go fast. You know what I mean? You don't want to wait till like turn 5 to play a Rook and a Flame Juggler together. That's just coming down a little bit too late. You want to get those self-damage things going as fast as possible in order to play your Imprisoned Horrors as soon as possible. So in other words, adding this like extra layer of 2 mana to reward some of your self-damage things could be problematic on occasion. Now, there are some cheap ways to deal damage. I think, you know, Spirit Bomb jumps out as the kind of best example. Like, there's a pretty good 3 mana play with Spirit Bomb into Fearless Flame Juggler, because then your Flame Juggler is basically a 2 mana 5/5, and that's still really good. Like, that gets you into that Rook territory. You're not even all that far away from like a Molten Giant as far as, you know, stat output. So I don't want to write it off totally, but it does sometimes, I think, struggle in some of those mid-game turns. And it's not like a card you want to play on turn 2. It's almost never going to be good. So then you're pushing it to turn 3 with like a Spirit Bomb or a Mass Production. Mass Production makes it a 4/4, which is still great, but not as like crazy. I know it sounds bad to say a 2-mana 4/4 is not crazy, but let's be real, it's not that crazy anymore. So it's just about finding that good moment for it when it's competing against some of those other mid-game sort of cards. Also, do keep in mind, Blood Treants don't activate this anymore. Blood Treants don't count as damage, they count as cost or whatever. So, you know, I don't know. It's not quite as clean as I'd like to imagine it feels like it is. I wonder if it makes the cut actually in Pain Warlock. Looking at the list and just how tight it is right now, this feels like one of those cards that sounds perfect on paper, but in practice might actually get left out because the deck is just so clean and efficient at what it does right now. And it has enough like cheap threat development that you might throw off the balance between I need enough cards to damage myself and I need enough cards to reward that damage. This is another one that leans towards rewarding that damage that's more expensive than a Molten Giant or an Imprisoned Horror very often that you're playing, hopefully for 0, right? So does that teeter in the wrong way and mean that the Flame Juggler doesn't make the cut? I don't know. I'm a little more worried about this than I think most people I've read have seemed to be worried about. So I would say this is maybe not a home run like some people think. Oh my god, I forgot to talk about Rogue again. This actually makes a little bit more sense to be in Rogue, weirdly, even though they don't have Pain Warlock synergies, just because weapon attacks are a pretty easy way to sometimes take a lot of damage, and a weapon is something you can kind of load up earlier, play a weapon, and then follow up with a Flame Juggler to sometimes, you know, take 4 by swinging into something, you know, and get yourself a little 2 and a 5/5. Again, not necessarily worth it to run the Tourist, I'm afraid, because the Rogue Tourist to get into Warlock cards is kind of slow, but something to keep in mind because weapon attacks are pretty cool for this. Moving on to the Cursed Souvenir. This is a 2-mana shadow spell. Give a minion +3/+3, and at the start of your turn, deal 3 damage to your hero. So another way to kind of activate your pain cards. But I think this one's honestly pretty clunky. The fact that you need to have a minion down for this is risky. Sometimes it's going to feel like it's stuck in hand. And you like need to get your Molten Giants, your Imprisoned Horrors out, and there's no great way for you to do that. This actually can be cast on opponent cards, which is kind of funny because it will then deal the 3 damage to their hero. So if you're willing to, you know, give them +3/+3, there could be some funny lethals or something out of this, because you like can't clear the board or you don't have any face damage. You could use this on them. But ultimately, I think it's gonna feel just a tad too awkward for Pain Warlock to run. Now, is there a world where maybe just like a zoo deck runs this and it's not even necessarily a pain build, but you know, you're rocking like some party fiends, you expect one of these to stick in a turn 2, you follow it up with a souvenir, and you're just kind of off to the races with like onboard stats and buffs and stuff. It's always a possibility, but I don't know, man. This still seems like the downside is notable in a game with so much lethality these days. If you're not committing to the pain plan and rewarding all that self-damage, and then the self-damage, I think, actually becomes pretty risky. So this doesn't feel efficient enough for me in Pain Warlock, or at least like consistent enough, maybe is the word. And then trying to expand it beyond that also just feels a little bit weird and hard to make it work. And I just don't see this working well in Rogue either. So I don't know, Cursed Souvenir falls short to me. And there you go. Those are the detailed reviews. So now let's rate these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Summoner Dark Marrow is a 4-star card. Party Planner Vona is a 4-star card. Sacrificial Imp is a 3-star card. Eat the Imp is a 4-star card. Bellfire Bonfire is a 3-star card. Announce Darkness is a 2-star card. Health Drink is a 4-star card. Party Fiend is a 4-star card. Fearless Flame Juggler is a 3-star card. Cursed Souvenir is a 2-star card. Yeah, that's it for the Warlock cards. These are a pretty fun bunch. This one in particular looks really fun to me. I'm curious to see if Death Knight comes to support some of these Death Rattle synergies any more than they already are. And I wonder if Pain Warlock can actually use some of this stuff to get even better. We'll see. But that said, share your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks so much, as always, for watching. And until next time, game on.